Well, joining us for some further analysis of the federal government's Bill C-5, this One Canadian Economy Act, and what it means for Canada's energy future. Very pleased to welcome to the program Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow and Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, also a Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada, and a Research Advisor to the Indigenous Resource Network. Heather, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, happy to be here.
This does seem like a bit of a sea change. You look at all the delays we've faced in the past in getting new projects built, the idea of expediting projects that are in the national interest. How big a change potentially is Bill C-5?
Well, at a philosophical or cultural level, it's a big change, and I think that out west and in industry in general, there's been a lot of enthusiasm, cautious optimism. We often say about the Carney government, about the Minister of Natural Resources and Energy, Tim Hodgson, and what they've been saying and doing. So delighted to see that the bill that is kind of the marquee bill of this government initially is to build bigger and faster. And as people like to say out here, we are opening for business. Not quite open, but it looks like we're opening for business.
Right. There's also the question, I guess, in terms of where pipelines fit into this and the question of, do we need a new pipeline, right? There's some talk of expanding existing infrastructure like Trans Mountain, but I guess as we assess the need question, how close are we to another capacity or egress issue in your view?
Yeah, and all this came up, because Minister Guilbeault mentioned that we're only at 40% utilization of Trans Mountain, which was not correct. In fact, the CEO of Trans Mountain, probably correcting the record, was in the Globe and Mail last week saying we're actually at 90%. And there's been strong demand for Canadian oil. We've seen the differential between the Western Canada Select, our benchmark crude, and the West Texas Intermediate being very narrow, historically narrow for the last few months. And so we know there's strong demand, and we know we're coming up to the end of it. So it's expected now that certainly by the first quarter of 2027 is when we'd probably run out of capacity in Canada or egress. If Enbridge expands its main line down to the United States, which is planning to do, that will go to 2028, but we'll still be in this crunch in 2028. That's not very long in oil and gas terms. So very much looking, first of all, to expand Trans Mountain itself, which we could add a couple 100,000 barrels with some improvements. But then we need that other big pipeline starting to come on board.
Yeah, so a bigger TMX doesn't preclude the need for another project.
All of the above. Yeah, we will need it. TMX will buy us some more time, but it won't get us out of the pickle we're in.
Now, it's interesting. BC's energy minister has suggested they'd be fine with making TMX bigger, having some new pump stations. Clearly, there's some uneasiness or even opposition with regard to a new pipeline project. But I mean, ultimately, this is federal responsibility and jurisdiction. As much as Mark Carney has suggested, I don't know, maybe he would defer to objections. What about that uncertainty?
Yeah, so we're talking about a Northern Gateway style project, maybe finishing in Prince Rupert instead of Kitimat, which is a bit further, but at least some of the concerns that people had originally with Northern Gateway. That is the one certainly that Premier Smith has been saying is the top of their list, and even talked this week about a 42-inch pipe holding 1 million barrels. So that's the kind of capacity that we're looking for. We do know from Trans Mountain that, Justin Trudeau and his government did push that through, that there was no consensus required. There was a lot of, legaling and judicial judgments that made that very clear. We know that very specifically in the case of BC and pipelines and bitumen, that they don't have a veto. We don't require their consensus. But certainly no one wants to go through the drama and building a $34 billion pipeline either, that having opposition entails. And so if you could get some political signals that they're not going to use every tool in the toolbox to block this pipeline, as they did with Trans Mountain, then you're going to be able to bring the cost of that pipeline down by billions of dollars, and the business case will be even better, and maybe even attract a private sector proponent to do it.
Yeah. I think that it's important to know that it would be deemed to be in the national interest, because I guess projects that don't meet that threshold, we're still stuck with the Impact Assessment Act and all of its problems, aren't we?
Well, and this is the thing about Bill C-5. Again, on the exterior, it's good to see the government so committed to building big things, and everyone likes to see that. But certainly doesn't solve all our problems. If we're talking about 3 or 4 or 5 national building projects that politicians choose, that leaves the other hundreds, that are in the queue in various, stages of federal and provincial regulatory processes, wondering, what about them? That they maybe competitively disadvantaged if a competitor gets chosen to be a project of national interest, or if resources from our regulatory system get directed just to those handful of projects and not to the ones that are already in the queue. So initially, people willing to give the benefit of the doubt and say, yes, it's good that we want to build. There's a handful of projects maybe that we do need to build, but ultimately it's the whole system that is going to need to improve, that we're going to need more regulatory efficiency. And I always say, I mean, you could build 6 pipelines. You could have 6 pipelines in the projects of national interest. If you have an emissions cap, you're not going to fill a single one of them. So there's you could build railways and ports. If you don't improve mine permitting, there's nothing that's going to be using those railways and those ports. And so it's not just about a handful of infrastructure projects, important as they may be. It's the whole ecosystem for investment here in Canada.
I guess there was the demand question. There was something else that Stephen Gabot talked about in his comments that you alluded to, that, suggesting we're near the peak of demand. Got quite a different assessment from the Secretary General of OPEC, who was speaking in Calgary at the Global Energy Show, talking more like 2050.
Mm-hmm.
This is all relevant and important, of course. What's your sense of where demand trends are headed?
Well, demand trends have only ever gone one way, and that's up. And if you look at a line, what are they comparable to? Population growth. And so there's not much of an expectation that we'll have less energy demand and more population growth. That's never gone hand in hand. And we know that we're at 8 billion people, and we'll soon, eventually be probably peaking at 10 billion people. And on top of that, you have energy demand from artificial intelligence, from air conditioning, and just people's, sleep life getting better, especially in Asia. 4.5 billion people, and we expect about 1 billion of them to move from the lower income to the middle classes in the next decade. So it looks like energy demand has no way to go but up. But the other big thing that we had to consider here in Canada is that it looks like American oil production is peaking this year also. And it used to be taboo to say that, and no one wanted to hear a Canadian tell an American that, their oil production was peaking. But actually this week, the EIA said it, the American Energy Information Administration said we've probably seen peak shale. So somebody's need to going to account for the growth that the United States itself has accounted for, and also backfill if we see some decline in production for the United States. And the obvious country to do that, and I hope it's not Saudi Arabia or Iran or Venezuela, that would introduce a lot of other problems. It better be Canada that's filling that supply gap.
Absolutely. And that's oil and that's natural gas too. And, it
Mhm.
took us so long, I think, to catch up to where many other countries were on our LNG export capacity. We're kind of there now. And we're actually seeing, I think, some pretty exciting things happening on that front. Is there reason for maybe more of a bullish case in developing and expanding our LNG capacity right now?
Absolutely. And the thing is that natural gas, oil is used in transportation fuels, but natural gas is used for electricity. And that's really where we're seeing the biggest demand drivers is on the electricity side. And so we have probably at the end of the month, we know that the first carrier to pick up LNG from Canada on its way to Kitimat, Petronas own carrier, is on its way now, should arrive there June 29th. And so that'll be finally the start of Canadian LNG exports and to reach customers other than the United States. And BC has in particular warmed up to LNG quite a bit, not to oil, not to bitumen, as we've seen, but have made some good moves to allow, for example, an LNG Canada Phase 2 to reach FID, to allow Silicens and the associated pipeline Prince Rupert gas transmission to reach approval and an FID. And those would be easy wins. Again, that would be very encouraging to the investment community, to the oil and gas sector. And I think probably in the summer, we will see some movement on those, and that would be very welcome.
Yeah, we just saw a big step forward with regard to an LNG terminal project in Prince Rupert, oddly enough. That has substantial Indigenous involvement as well. And I think that's the other component of these conversations that we're seeing on the LNG side. Where we're moving forward with these projects. You've got First Nations involvement. It's kind of the new model of how these projects can work.
Yeah, and this is a win-win-win, and proponents have worked hard for this. It's and they sooner see Indigenous investment than anyone else's investment, and it really lowers the risk of projects. But it's the kind of thing that we can lift all boats. We can live in Canada with more natural resource development. So we're seeing the Haisla involved with Cedar LNG. We're seeing the Nisga'a involved with Silicens LNG in the pipeline, and in Prince Rupert we have been seeing a really growth in propane exports. Kind of falling under the radar. They are shipped there by train, and then involves like Black's and a few other coastal nations. So lots of great stories to tell, and lots more that we could tell if we had a bit better regulatory system.
Right. And as we talk about C-5 as a step in the right direction, but we've still got the emissions cap that would apply to Alberta. We've got all kinds of other regulations that are still obstacles. Do we need to see some more progress on the regulatory side still?
Absolutely. And we know that Premier Smith had her list of 9 demands, and it raised a lot of hackles, and people thought it was a bit outrageous. But from their perspective, most of those laws, and from my perspective, most of the demands are to get rid of laws that are unconstitutional, that intervene inappropriately, overreach into provincial jurisdiction. You can think of the emissions cap, which is a production cap. You can think of the Impact Assessment Act, which has already been ruled to be unconstitutional and only had a few amendments. The clean electricity regulations obviously goes into, it has the word electricity in it. Electricity is a provincial jurisdiction. So there are many poor policies that are absolutely inhibiting investment. And so something needs to be happened on those too. I think I understand with the emissions cap, they're trying to have, the grand bargain, as it's called, on other ways that we could reduce emissions intensity out of bitumen, rather than having this emissions cap. And I certainly encourage them and hope that they find a way forward.
Well, what do you make of carbon capture? Because yeah, that seems to be maybe where the trade-off
Mhm.
is, or the grand bargain, and we're poised for some substantial investments in, for example, the Pathways Alliance project. But I don't know. I mean, how real is this?
I mean, they've themselves, the oil and gas industry, that's what they've picked. It's the group of 6 major oil sands producers that have said, we're going to try Pathways Alliance. We think this is what will work. But they need, they're publicly traded companies with the mandate to earn profits for their shareholders, and this is an ambitious and expensive project. And so, if it's for a public good, which is to reduce carbon emissions, which everyone benefits for, then we expect that the federal government and the provincial government come in and help to make it palatable to shareholders, to make it possible for them. They still, if they just come out and say every dollar we earn right now is going to go to carbon capture and lowering emissions, they will be left with no shareholders and no investors. And we won't, and Venezuela will fill the markets and that kind of a thing. So we have to do this in a way that makes economic sense. And I think the timeline might be, need to be negotiated, and the share of who's paying for what needs to be negotiated. But it's certainly a way to get the Canadian bitumen barrel as a heavy oil below not only the heavy oil average of emissions intensity, but the global average of emissions intensity.
Well, some big decisions ahead on many fronts for sure. We'll see how it all plays out. In the meantime, we'll leave it there. Heather, appreciate your insights on all of this. Thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Great to be here.